It's no secret to anyone who watches Disney that two of their biggest shows, particularly on Disney XD, would be Amphibia and The Owl House. And that is for good reason. These shows are really good. One is better than the other, but I'll leave you dangling on which I prefer. Both are shows centered around a protagonist with a rather normal life being sucked into a fantastical world through a portal that they happen upon somehow, whether it be a door in an abandoned house or a box in an old antique shop. The protagonist finds themselves stuck in another world searching for a way to get home. Despite how similar these series are, the protagonists of each, Noceda and Boonchuy, couldn't be more different. While both are slightly similar in tone, neither are completely the same in the deeper ends of personality. Luz is upbeat, kind, and a geek like us. She loves her fantasy novels and her anime shows, so to be Isekai'd in real life must be an absolute dream come true for her. Anne, on the other hand, has severe doubts about herself deep down. Under the surface, Anne can be described as lonely, self-centered, and socially awkward. These stand in direct opposition to Luz. And while both protagonists display incredible strength of will as well as some character development, neither can be considered to be your typical Mary Sue. They have their own issues. For Anne, it's what she thinks about and how she treats herself. For Luz, it's what others think about her. However, these bugs in personality and character are slowly working out through their journey to the other world, and through the growth they find when interacting with the denizens there. But now we come to the meat of this what if. What would have happened if they hadn't traveled to the worlds where they landed? What if Luz was sent to Amphibia?
Before we start with the video, we'd just like to take a second to thank our sponsor, Manscaped. Manscaped is the global brand for men's grooming and hygiene products covering everything from head to toe. If you want to start your day off right, you can't do wrong with their all-in-one Performance Package 4.0, which includes the high-technology Lawnmower 4.0 body trimmer, electric, waterproof, and the safest method for beard trimming. As someone with a beard and struggling to keep it maintained, this is an excellent tool choice to keep your face clean, and, you know, it can be used for other areas of your body as well. You can even use it freely without a cord for up to 90 minutes with a full charge. You know, in case you have a beard that takes 90 minutes to trim. Go to manscaped.com today and get 20% off plus free international shipping plus 2 free gifts when you use the promo code Frederator at checkout.
Our story would start out the same. She'd be in the principal's office with her mother discussing her conduct in school. It's not that Luz had been a bad student, but she had a bad habit of taking things overboard, which more often caused issues for her classmates and the school in general. Her mother, Camila Noceda, decides that it would be best to send her daughter to a summer camp that would help her make friends and disconnect from some of the things that had taken over her life. She's getting ready to leave when all of a sudden a creature takes her favorite fantasy novel and runs off with it. Luz would chase after it as it runs into an abandoned building. This is the first encounter that Luz has with the door. She would pass through, but through the power of what if magic, we have done something that the Ghostbusters warned us not to do, and crossed the streams. Instead of ending up where the creature that stole her book had gone, Luz somehow ends up in a different locale. She finds herself sitting in the mud in the middle of nowhere. Cue the theme song. She wanders into Wartwood and is amazed by all the frog people running around. To her, they look like something you'd find in Dungeons and Dragons. To Luz, this looks like an answer to her prayers. Instead of being sent to a boring summer camp designed to pacify her imagination, she's taken to a dimension which lies at the very heart of it. Of course, being as the residents call her a long, gangly creature, the people are instinctively scared of her, not unlike how they'd been with Anne. However, Luz would eventually be taken in by the Plantars, who would provide the confused and oddly excited girl with a place to call home. Of course, they're still suspicious of her, but their overall kindness refuses to allow them to let a helpless person perish alone in the cold. Polly's suspicious and overall explosive nature would really catch Luz's attention, making her slightly offended at the idea that she would eat them, even though she does admit that where she came from, humans do eat frogs, which would cause Polly to trust her even less and dare her to try it. Luz would try to backtrack and instead make things worse by essentially telling them that frogs disgust her, and then backtrack even further and say that the Plantars don't count, to which it would increase the awkwardness in the household. In this way, Polly begins to believe that Luz would be incapable of harming the family due to her lack of general ability to even produce coherent thought lines. However, this doesn't stop her from keeping an eye on the human. The frogs of Wartwood would be just as weary of Luz as they would be of Anne, so they would more than likely want to be rid of her just the same. When it comes down to the mantis attack, Luz would be pretty startled, terrified even. She would want to run like everyone else, but if she saw people in danger, she is the kind of person who would naturally attempt to save them. Luz is not really a particularly powerful combatant. She's not as trained in combat like Anne is, so it would be more in character for her to try to get its attention and lead it away. Luz can't fight against it, but she would let the landscape do the fighting for her. She would lure it to a place where it would be unable to escape from. The townsfolk would then start to at least accept her presence and right to be there. So she would easily move in with the Plantars and make a little life in Wartwood, not too unlike how Anne had. After this, Luz would want to go exploring. She wouldn't particularly care about the lake as much as Anne would have, but she would still want to explore. Hot Pop would have the same reaction. She may be allowed to stay in Wartwood, but she's still considered something worth hiding. Luz would pout about it a bit, but just as Anne would have, she would convince Sprig to let her out. Together they would happen upon Maddie Flower out in the forests. Sprig would try to hide from her and tell Luz that they need to get away. Luz would ask why, but Sprig would not give any definite answer. Luz would ignore the warnings and introduce herself, especially after seeing Maddie test some dark magic. She would recall her favorite book about the good witch Azura, which would feel like she's living her fantasy out. She would go to Maddie and ask how she was doing this. Maddie would merely tell her it was magic. Luz would choke off a squeal and ask if she could teach her. At first, Maddie would be confused why such a gangly, strange creature was asking her to teach her, but she relents and begins to explain the process of how she casts her spells, the powders, rituals, how far to go, when to stop, and the higher levels of magic's abilities. Maddie admits that she doesn't know everything there is to know about it, but that she's still learning and basically teaching herself. Luz would be enamored by this and would try to learn more about it. Her trips to see Maddie would become more and more frequent as time passes, and Luz quickly begins to pick up Wartwood's unique type of magic. One thing that should be noted is that Luz's abilities would grow far faster in Amphibia due to the levels of magic and its uses being more compatible with her physiology. It doesn't require any magic bile sacs or having to teach herself by somehow managing to capture an image on her phone. She has a proper teacher that can teach her everything they know. Luz's growth in magic would thus be accelerated, making her a bit more combat ready, especially in Amphibia as opposed to the Boiling Isles. The town's annual potluck would occur. After trying some of Hot Pop's food she plans to bring, Luz thinks it would be better to make something else. She would tell them that they might do better to make something else and recommends enchiladas since they're easy to make, have enough kick to grab attention, and just flat out delicious. She begins to write out some ingredients, but some of the things she mentions, the Plantars have never heard of. Luz would need to find stand-in ingredients for those. One thing she does need would be tomatoes for the sauce to make it just like Mama used to. Turns out the only place to get a tomato is from a killer tomato plant. Things got teeth and everything. Luz, however, wouldn't be phased. Due to her studies with Maddie, Luz would be able to whip up a cursed lickety-split. Just before they could get eaten, she would cast the spell and defeat the beast. Having made the enchiladas, they submit it for judging. The town goes crazy for it, and the Plantars manage to win the blue ribbon. Luz would later show the Plantars her phone. She would introduce Sprig to her favorite anime, Monster Slayer Academia, which Sprig would become obsessed with. But Luz only has a single season saved on her phone, which Sprig absolutely snaps over. But Luz would offer to let him read some of the manga she would have brought, which Sprig would blast through. Hot Pop is glad that Sprig is reading, but wishes he would read something more substantial besides those human comic books. I could see it as a running gag in the episode where Luz and Hot Pop argue over whether they're considered comics or manga, but it's hard to convey that through a short video like this, so use your imagination. Regardless, she offers to let Sprig borrow her Good Witch books. Hot Pop would be a bit more pleased. However, Luz would later in the night find Hot Pop reading her manga, which he denies, but Luz knows that Hot Pop would secretly love it. Sprig and Hot Pop would later have their tussle over who should run the farm, but all things being said, Luz would be more than likely not to do anything that Anne didn't do, so that would stay the same. As for the episode Girl Time, that likely wouldn't really happen since Luz isn't really the judgmental type. She wouldn't care if Polly is tomboyish. She'd be more likely to try to compete with Polly in the spitting contest rather than tell her she's wrong. After all, Luz is here in the first place because someone wanted to change her for being her, so why should she treat Polly the same way? Luz would later take note of Sprig's attraction to Ivy, and would do her best to help Sprig achieve it, but Sprig would mention that he's still promised to Maddie. Luz's jaw would hit the floor. She would have never guessed that this was the reason why he avoided Maddie. Sprig would be stressed about it, so Luz would offer to tell Maddie for him, which he would accept. Luz would tell Maddie about it when they next met, and Maddie would mention that she already knew by the way he avoided her, but wished that he had the heart to at least tell her personally. She would also try to set Ivy and Sprig up, but upon telling the rest of the Plantars, they would make a big to-do about it and try to turn it into an official courtship in hopes of uniting the two families for business purposes, which Luz tells Hop Pop is not the point of Sprig's crush. They're supposed to help set them up, not capitalize on their young love. Much like the original story, Luz and the others get captured by the pair of love doves, and end up being saved by Sprig and Ivy. The next episode, generally titled Contagion, would occur, but it's a bit different. A big storm hits Wartwood, and to save the crops, Hop Pop would commission Luz to help him and the rest of the family protect them. Originally, Anne would fake being ill, but would try to help the Plantars when they got sick. Instead, Luz would actually submit and help the Plantars. They'd be able to move faster due to Luz's help, but they would all still get sick, including Luz. But there would be no red leg scare due to Luz not being well enough to cook them up a nice bowl of cleaning supply soup. They would all just rest until they got better. When they do their family shrub, as Anne would be so bored from it, Luz on the other hand would find so much pleasure learning about the family history. Coming from a Hispanic family, she would have the importance of family ingrained within her. However, this would awaken feelings of exclusion and loneliness within her, as she would realize that she is missing her mother and is all alone here in Wartwood. While Hop Pop is out, the Plantars and Luz would discover the secret passage that would tell them more about their family. When they get to the Tetris puzzle, Luz would not be as able as Anne was. So she would more than likely throw an explosive curse at it and blow the door down entirely just so they could escape. She would later learn that she isn't alone, and that the Plantars, her surrogate family, is a true family to her nonetheless. They would have quite a few one-off adventures, and the next big thing they would do would be the trip to the archives, but given that most of this episode stays practically the same, it's not really worth mentioning. Eventually, Luz would spot the Moss Man, but nobody in Wartwood or even the Plantars believe her. She would continue her training with Maddie. Maddie would say that Luz seems down, even more so than herself, which means something was wrong. Luz would tell Maddie that she witnessed the Moss Man, but nobody believed her. Maddie would tell her that she believes her. Luz would likely claim that Maddie only believes her out of pity, but Maddie would state that she actually believes in the Moss Man. As a practitioner of magic, the concept of a Moss Man existing is not just a possibility, but a fact. She would state that she'll help her find proof of the Moss Man in exchange for getting some of its moss. Maddie would tell her that items made of mystical cryptids are far stronger than any other thing you could put in a magic spell. Luz would agree, and together they would set out looking for the Moss Man. Luz would show her where she last witnessed the beast, and Maddie would use her knowledge of mystical things to plot a course that would lead them to areas where the Moss Man is likely to be. Together they find him, and Luz would manage to get a video of it, and Maddie would be able to find some discarded moss, which would please her quite a bit. They would return to Wartwood, but nobody would believe the video due to not knowing how a phone works. The Plantars, on the other hand, would manage to start believing Luz's eyewitness testimony due to understanding how a phone works better than the others. So in the end, it's a salvageable win to Luz since her surrogate family at least believes her now. She would later find a music box among her belongings. She's not sure where it came from or how it got there, but she brings it back and tells Hop Pop about it. Hop Pop would seemingly freak out but deny knowing what it is. He would bury it and tell Luz to never speak of it again. She'd ask what it was, and he would show her the book that claims it brings chaos. Can't argue with that logic, but she begins to wonder more about it, and she keeps it in her mind. Snow Days events would occur, and it would actually be pretty much the same. However, whether she would defrost Sprig or not is not known to me. Luz is generally pleased enough being alone, so if she thought that Sprig needed it to stay healthy, she more than likely would leave him alone. But when Polly gets taken, she might have a harder time dealing with it. However, she would manage to beat the giant albino weasel and feed its family. She would manage to befriend the weasel as well, visiting it often. Eventually, Hop Pop goes to CropCon, so he leaves Luz, Polly, and Sprig at a daycare where they encounter Tritonio Espada, who brings them in. He begins to teach them how to fight with weapons. Luz doesn't do very well as she's less of a physical combatant and more of a supporting mage. She likens her skills to her class in a tactical RPG. Tritonio decides to give up on teaching her more about sword techniques, certain that her use of magic would cover whatever she lacks in blade work. It turns out they're going to rob a train, but the Plantars discover this and double-cross Tritonio after he double-crosses them, and they return to their daily lives, unwilling to tell anyone, even Hop Pop, that they helped rob a train. After all this, Luz would be elected as Frog of the Year in Wartwood. She would enjoy the party when suddenly a hooded figure calls out for her at the bridge. She goes over to see, only to find Sasha. Sasha would remove her cloak and just look at Luz. She'd make a simple statement. "You're not Anne." Luz would question who Anne was, and Sasha would just say, "A friend." Sasha would ask how Luz got there, and she would mention a door that she passed through. Sasha would be confused and say that she got here from a strange music box. Luz would mention that she found a music box, and Sasha would beg her to give it to her so that she could find a way to get home. In exchange, she promised to help Luz get home as well. Luz decides to trust Sasha, as she's the only other human from the human world that she has seen in Amphibia, and decides to fetch the box and deliver it. Meanwhile, the citizens are slowly being rounded up. It turns out that Hot Pop's run for mayor has started a bit of an insurrection, and so they plan to kill Hot Pop as an example. Sprig quickly figures this out and starts a riot and then tells Luz. Luz ends up getting into a fight with Sasha. Sasha would be using her sword, but Luz is more used to using something closer to a staff, generally for magic purposes and to be closer to the concept of Azura. Her staff wouldn't hold up long enough against the sharp weapon, and eventually it would snap under the pressure. Luz would flee throughout the tower to escape from Sasha and would manage to take the music box back as she does so. She's forced to the roof and is cornered, but she manages to get the upper hand when the frogs of Wartwood appear to help her, and she manages to cast a spell to defeat Sasha. Sasha escapes with the toads before the tower collapses. Luz and the frogs make their way back to Wartwood. She tells Hot Pop what Sasha said about the music box and believes it can be used to get home. They decide that the best way to get answers is to go to Newtopia. On their way, they meet a troupe of traveling actors, led by the famous playwright Renee Frogers. Hot Pop decides he needs to join, and Sprig and Polly attempt to make friends with the other actors. Sprig has a harder time making it as an actor. Luz would also attempt to be an actor as well, but she is criticized like Sprig is. She sort of stops caring though and has fun cosplaying instead, and Sprig would eventually make it to the same circle as Polly. The rest of the episode continues on as normal. Swamp and Sensibility's plot comes soon afterwards, and given that Anne has already done what Luz would have, it's likely that it wouldn't change much. Luz might try to talk to One-Eyed Wally's father and try to get him to understand that Wally deserves to be who he desires to be. Whether this would change much of the plot or not is unknown. The Plantars finally make it to Newtopia, where they encounter Marcy. Marcy would kindly meet the new human, though she's confused where she came from and why Anne isn't here. She makes all her usual observations about the family and tells Luz that she is lucky to have found a farming community. Marcy and Luz would actually begin to bond about their love of all things otaku. Marcy would liken herself to playing the part of a rogue, and Luz would talk about herself playing the part of a support mage. They would find themselves talking about playing their favorite video games, and Luz knows that if she had known Marcy beforehand, the two would have been good friends. More than likely, Marcy and Luz would exchange information for whenever they reach Earth again to continue their friendship. Marcy tells them about the ants that are plaguing the city, and how they need to deal with them as their first priority. Together, Marcy, Luz, and the Plantars would manage to deal with the ants. Marcy would compliment Luz's use of magic, and Luz would inform her of Maddie, who she studied under. Together they go into the city of Newtopia, where Marcy would practically single-handedly solve a puzzlegram with an order from the king of Newtopia commanding her to bring the Plantars before the king. Luz would question why the king would use such a roundabout way of delivering a message, and Marcy would state that it's just a lot of fun. They're taken to meet King Andrias, who jovially greets them much to Luz's delight. His size is off-putting, but Luz is completely taken in by the king's facade to an incredible degree. Luz and Polly would go with Hot Pop on the tour, and Luz would want to get away, but she's a good bit less rebellious than Anne is, so she'd more than likely just suck it up after Hot Pop tells her she can't leave the tour. Later, the Plantars go to the shopping district, and Luz is possessed with the idea to get her mother a gift. They enter the derby for it, but Luz isn't as physically strong as Anne is, and so she decides to rely more upon magic, but even then she is still beaten by Priscilla the Killa. However, Priscilla's daughter gives them the butterfly charm as a consolation, and Luz is content with the gift. She and Sprig later that night would talk about their own mothers. Luz would talk about how she never was really accepted for who she is by her mother, and that she would often find herself in trouble for being herself. Sprig drops a Zuko style, "That's rough, buddy," and proceeds to tell her about he never met his mother, but for odd reasons he still misses her. This moment brings both Sprig and Luz to tears and forces Luz to take a long look at the relationship she has with her mother, and how truly lucky she is to have a mother who cares enough about her to send her to summer camp to become a more productive human being. Later, she's invited to a sleepover with Marcy, and Polly and Sprig are invited to come along. Most of the sleepover stays the same though. The next day, it's time to say goodbye, and Luz would be sad to see the Plantars go. In the end, Marcy says that she can always come pick her up when it's time to charge the gems, and so Luz decides to go back home with the Plantars. They return home to Wartwood and immediately realize they forgot to get the gifts for the villagers. Hot Pop and Polly panic and try to convince Luz and Sprig to call a Chickalisk to fake an attack. Sprig is easily on board, but Luz would refuse to allow this to happen, and would opt in to tell the truth so they don't get in worse trouble like they would have if they had gone through with the ritual. Remember, Luz has been studying with Maddie, so she knows the ritual to summon a Chickalis. She also knows the risks that summoning an eldritch god to deal with your dirty laundry could pose. It's revealed they were too busy to get the items, and while the villagers are upset, they get over it quickly, since they already half expected the Plantars to screw it up. As for the next episode, Ivy on the Run, the events of it likely wouldn't happen, as Ivy would have never come upon Luz and Polly practicing martial arts. Muay Thai to be exact. That same badass fighting style that Annie Leonhardt was using. Wait, Annie? Coincidence? I think not. Instead, they'd be practicing magic, which likely wouldn't attract the same attention. Luz and the Plantars would later get a letter from Marcy informing them that she's coming to pick them up. Getting the box ready, they pack and wait for Marcy to come. She'd eventually arrive and take them to the location of the first temple. The story mostly stays the same, except there's no quarrel between Luz and Hot Pop like there had been between Anne and Hot Pop. After returning to Wartwood, Marcy is upset that the people don't like her very much. But Luz would inform Marcy that it was the same for her, and that it would require time and patience. Marcy would follow Luz to Maddie, the latter of whom is trying to bring a dead pet back to life. Luz gets interested in the concept and attempts to help, all while Marcy's taking notes. Maddie's siblings would get upset because Maddie had promised to play with them, but is too consumed in her work to do so. They nearly ruin the experiment, and in return, an angry Maddie screams at them to grow up, which they take literally and attempt to use a magic spell to do so. In response, Maddie, Luz, and Marcy team up to help Maddie since her siblings had done the spell wrong and could get hurt. Using the spell the right way, Maddie would mix up an antidote and proceed to fix her siblings as well as herself. She would promise to play more with them. Luz, on the other hand, is too busy trying to figure out how Maddie did the spell correctly, attempting to learn the formula for the spell herself. They would later journey to the second temple, where they would meet Valeriana, a person they had never met before because, due to Hot Pop taking the music box away, they would have never gone to the Bazaar. Most of the things that happened to Anne happen to Luz as well, and are mostly solved the same way. When taken to the temple proper, Luz is accused of her misdeeds, especially running away from her mother. But when Luz saves Valeriana, she reveals that she had been the guardian of the temple, and that they had been in the temple the whole time. She helps Luz repower the box's second gem, and they return home. They eventually go to the third temple where they encounter Sasha and Grime. After a short battle, Sasha manages to convince Luz that she has changed ways and just wants to go home. They set aside their differences and proceed to finish the temple and charge the final gem on the music box. Due to her friendship with Marcy, the Plantars and Luz invite Sasha and Grime over for dinner, but things take a rocky turn, or more like, it starts off rocky and takes a turn down Broken Glass Avenue. But in the end, Sasha and Marcy make amends. When a battle of the bands is called, Marcy and Sasha decide to bring the band back together, but they lament that Anne isn't there to play her part. So instead, they pressure Luz into the part. She isn't really good at playing any instrument, so they just give her a keyboard and tell her to follow the colored patterns. Luz ends up burning up the board, which surprises even Sasha and Marcy, but despite the crowd going crazy for it, Grime still takes the gold with his 3-hour harp solo. They return to Newtopia with a completed box, and the Plantars are ready to say goodbye to their friend Luz. However, when they get there, it's revealed that Grimm and Sasha had planned a takeover to remove Andrias from power. But in truth, he was truly the villain, as he had planned to use the box to conquer the other worlds. A fight breaks out in which Sprig is nearly killed, but saved by Marcy. Polly grows out her legs in the spur of the moment and uses them to nab the box. Luz engages with Andrias in a battle, but the colossal newt is too much for her to handle alone, so she improvises in a classic Luz way and manages to gain the upper hand for a short period of time. However, she loses control of the battle quickly when he shows his true cunning side, and it becomes apparent that she needs something more to succeed. Luz would remember the spell she had prepared to cast on herself. Her spell causes her to grow in size, just as Maddie and her siblings had. This gives her the strength to face down Andrias, but her size causes her to rupture the castle and bring it crashing down. Miraculously, Luz, the Plantars, Sasha, and Marcy survive. But so does Andrias. Sasha and Marcy know that they're in the middle of a losing battle, so they decide to send Luz and the Plantars to the real world so they can plan a way to stop Andrias. They open a portal with the music box, and Marcy finds herself on the wrong end of Andrias' blade. Luz cries out for her as the portal closes and the season ends. I am aware that this is not the end of the story and that a new season is out, but I thought it would be a good place to end it since the newest season currently has not ended yet. So for now, this is all you get for Luz and Amphibia. However, this is only one half of a story. Another half involving what would happen if Anne landed in the Boiling Isles is in the works, so look forward to that. Anyway, I hope you will all leave a comment below to tell me where things would change in your opinion. Give us a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ring that bell to know when we release new content. Peace out, friends, and remember, Frederator loves ya.